It's his theory of forms, with his emphasis on teleology in nature. Now, I popped up a slide here for you that gives kind of just a nice definition. Goes into 4 fundamental types of explanations that, when brought together to explain why or what something is, how, you get a more robust explanation, as opposed to just limiting yourself to one type of explanation or indebtedness. So look here, you have one of the causes is identified as the material cause. And what does that answer? It's explaining something. If you look, you'll see that what is this table made out of? What are the materials that make up this thing? And you say, well, it's oak or wood. Well, you're giving a material cause. Now, the problem is, if you just restricted yourself to material explanations, there'd be no way to explain the difference between the table, the wood table, and the wood carving of some, say, statue. What you need is a formal cause, a formal explanation. So we move here, and you see the formal cause answers. And again, with artifacts, this is going to be somewhat superficial. When you get into biological entities, it's much more profound than just kind of superficial or an idea given to, let's say, the wood. And I'll explain why that may or may not be intrinsic essence of what something is. But you see here with the formal cause is, well, it explains the form in which all the material parts are arranged. The idea that you impose upon the material wood. And what is your idea? The eidos, the form, is something that's a elevated surface that can support things. This is what we would call, let's say, a table or a desk. Now, the reason why I bring up, and I think it was Wittgenstein that brought this up, is a critique that with regard to things like artifacts, it doesn't seem that there's any intrinsic form. For example, one man's table could be a little child's fort. There's nothing, it's what the person attributes to the material. So it's not as if the material, in this case of the desk, is something that has the idea of deskness intrinsically by nature. But I find it still, nevertheless, useful to explain from artifacts, and then we can move further into biological entities that would have a formal cause that arranges all the material parts in of itself to a particular end that makes it be what it is intrinsically. But we also need an efficient cause. Why? Because that explains the source of change, source of motion. It causes the thing to be what it is, or in the particular shape that it is. And so you have what's called the efficient cause. Now, with biological entities, that's often identified as the agent cause. For example, the source of our motion of coming into being would be our parents. Proximate efficient cause would be the agent cause, which are our parents. But now look, we have the final cause, no pun intended, the last cause. And what is that answer? The purpose for which the thing exists. Now, Aristotle tells us that the formal cause and the final cause are the same. You're just looking at it from two different aspects. The final cause is you're looking at the formal cause in terms of the end. Because remember, as I gave that example, it's when you see the idea at the very end of the process of change that then explains the purpose for each antecedent event and state that's prior to the end. So there, you take all four causes, that out of which something's made, that into which something's made, i.e. the formal cause, that from which the thing comes to be, the efficient cause, and that for the sake of which something comes to be, i.e. the final cause, and you bring that all in those four explanations to explain something, and again, you get a more robust understanding of what something is in nature. Okay, let's see. Let me return back to right here. I'm looking for, there we go, my camera. All right, I'm back. So giving you a couple slides, I'm coming back. And I'll get better at switching back and forth between these things as I get more used to it. But I'd like a little practice with this, and this will make a good video for practicing, getting better at this. So again, what we're doing is we're identifying with Aristotle a particular conception of nature, because the way that he views nature, this is his starting point for his paradigm, is going to determine his ethics, what man is, and what it means to live the good life for a human being. Okay, well, let's return to Aristotle. Now, if I have, let's back up there. Aristotle's, one of his most famous works, his ethical works, is the Nicomachean Ethics. He had two ethical works that we know of: Nicomachean Ethics and I believe Eudaimonic Ethics is the other. Nicomachus was the son of Aristotle, so he names his treatise after his son. Now, ethics is an interesting thing, because it's a particular type of discipline that's going to be different than other types of disciplines. Now, the reason why I bring that up is that Aristotle states in the Nicomachean Ethics that it's not his point to try to persuade us to be good. So why do we read ethics books? In other words, one might be inclined to say, well, to become good. Aristotle knows that's not possible. That there are no amount of books that, let's take a well-known reprobate. Who's the... Come here, guys. Famous libertine. What's his name? I can't. What's the famous libertine's name? Hello? Famous libertine. The Marquis de Sade. Thank you. There are no amount of ethics books, no matter how well the writer is, that we're going to give the Marquis de Sade that's going to reform his ways and make him to a good person. Now, there are some disciplines that, well, how do I get good at, say, science or calculus or mathematics or something like this? Well, I study and I learn about it. I learn the science of mathematics or the science of calculus or something like that. Or I learn, I study Newton's Principia and I get good at physics. But there's other disciplines that no amount of theoretical study is going to make you good at. A classic example of this would be music. You could study all the music theory that you want. It is not going to make you a good musician. And as we all know, what makes you a good musician is practice. Practice makes perfect, as we always hear. And that's because that's within a particular type of knowledge, a practical knowledge, as opposed to theoria. It's just theory. And so Aristotle had made this distinction. And obviously there's things like medicine, music, and, as you will guess, ethics that fall within the domain of a science that is a practical science. So in other words, just as you would get good at playing piano by practicing and not merely just studying theory, likewise, when it comes to the domain of ethics, that studying ethics within theory does not make you a good person. You have to practice it. And so therefore, Aristotle, understanding this, has the point of Nicomachean ethics not to persuade you to be good or show you how to behave in circumstances in life. It's to give people who already are leading a happy or a virtuous life insight into their own nature of their own souls. So he's outlining, as I see I put here, the conditions for achieving that moral excellence. It's like giving those who already have a virtuous life, if they want insight into it, it outlines the conditions for which one achieved this. And so, in the Nicomachean Ethics, he's going to talk about moral virtue. Now, moral virtue for Aristotle, he believes, is a state of character. And he believes that state of character is expressed in choice. Now I'm just going to come out here and return to if I got my pen and my board. Now, some of you already might have picked up that choice might be important when it comes to ethics. Because choice has to do, that is real choice, with freedom. And this is something Immanuel Kant's going to talk about as well. There are no moral oughts without freedom. Every ought, he says, implies a can. And this is even a principle in law that maybe intuitively we all know that if we really lived in a deterministic, materialistic universe, why is anybody morally responsible, culpable for anything? I mean, the way a book falls off the shelf or a rock rolls down the hill and smashes into, let's say, somebody's window, nobody in their right mind is going to say, well, how immoral of that rock or book to fall down like that. And the reason why we know that's not in the sphere of morality is because the rock and the book don't possess something very interesting and unique called will or free will. And so we don't hold them morally accountable. They are determined by antecedent causal events. Now imagine if we actually believed and had a worldview in which we really did believe everything was causally determined. How is somebody murdering and killing somebody or eating them any worse than the book falling off the shelf and hitting me on the head or the rock rolling down? It's just causally determined. And you know who, for as sick as he was able to at least have the insight and intelligence to know this very same principle was Jeffrey Dahmer. And Jeffrey Dahmer, knowing that his accusers, many of them, were materialists that had a deterministic worldview, called him out on the same thing. How are you saying I'm wrong and immoral for killing and eating these people? It's nothing more than just like the rock rolling down it's all causally determined. And so anybody that's reflective, as is Immanuel Kant, knows that that's absolutely true. Unless you're free to do otherwise and you're not determined, then there is no morality. You cannot say you ought not to have done that, Jeffrey Dahmer. There's no oughts in the world of just causal determined is. That doesn't make any sense. And so Aristotle realizes this as well. And so he realized that moral virtue, again, is a state of character, but it involves choice. And it involves a choice lying an appropriate mean. Now, this is something that comes up with the ancient Greeks. And many of you might know about in mathematics. And you have this in Euclid's. I'm going to try to find all my books. I'm going to get better about organizing them. But Euclid's Elements. The mean proportional in mathematics. So let's say I have a triangle right here, right angle. Okay. And let's call this. Wish I had a napkin. Can you grab me a napkin? It's still a little wet from my pen's not ready. Okay, let's try it with a blue marker. There we go. So here we have line AB, BC, and BD. Now, in mathematics, what the mean proportional is line AB here is to that line BC as BC is to BD. Okay, so the mean proportional is obviously this. It is the middle between two extremes. And by the way, some of you might know that this proportion is actually, what we can do here is do another one like that, this, like that, so on and so on. You can connect those into the golden spiral right there that you find throughout nature. And so this is a wonderful mathematical principle that you can see throughout nature. Aristotle is going to use this. Not only is this a principle in nature, but this flows through organically within the moral nature of mankind too. Because extremes, when it comes to making choices, are going to be vices, the wrong. So not only in order to be within the ethical domain do you have the free will, to possess free will, the freedom to make the choice between options, you have to have rationality. So you see that those two principles go hand in hand. Freedom and rationality. This is why we don't hold our animals morally culpable and send them to kitty and doggy jail for doing things that you'd say, bad dog, wrong. Obviously, we're anthropomorphizing there. Why? Because animals do not have rationality. They may have levels of intelligence, but they don't have what we would classify as rationality. And they don't have freedom of will in the terms that we define as human beings. They operate by instinct. And so you can train an animal using kind of Pavlovian stimulus and response. But it's really incorrect and not appropriate to actually think that animals are moral creatures. And nobody could be serious about that consistently. Otherwise, we really would start putting together tribunals for animals and cats for pooping on the couch, right? And doing other things. But we don't, because we intuitively know that they operate by instinct. They don't have complete free will in the sense that we've defined here, and they don't have rationality, although they might have various levels of intelligence. And so Aristotle identifies those. The moral virtue, therefore, must be a state of character expressed in choice, lying in a mean. So the virtue is going to be here. So remember I had said that these are going to be vices. This is going to be the virtue, the middle way. And it's what a wise person, he says, what a wise person would prescribe. So what's interesting about that is he automatically links, by stating that, he links moral virtues to intellectual virtues. Yes, they're linked. Now what we have here on the extremes is either an excess or a deficiency. And those are vices. The middle will be the virtue. And so let me just give you an example. He has a whole set of these that he goes down, but I'll just only use one for now. Cowardness under deficiency is a vice. So somebody comes in and attempts to kill your family with an ink marker, and you go, "Oh, I'm so scared, help me," and you run away and your family's killed, and then you become known as the coward. You're deficient in something. Now you can have the opposite extreme here, which is not a virtue but an excess, which is still a vice because it's within the realm of the extreme. That's to act rashly. So I'll save you, and you jump straight into and you poke your eye out without thinking. You act excessively, right? And not only do you not save your family, you end up losing your eye on a blue marker. Wrong. These are vices. Well, what is the middle way, the virtue, the mean proportion between the two extremes? And that is identified as courage. And remember, I'd explained that because what the wise person would lay down, that the virtue here, just lost my pen cap, is an intellectual virtue. It's going to require intellect, not acting rashly and not acting like a coward, but acting virtuously. And so again, we have both in the Eudaimonian ethics and the Nicomachean ethics this wonderful expression that Aristotle explains what moral virtue is, that it's a state of character expressed in a choice, lying in the appropriate mean, determined by the prescription that a wise person would lay down, which again makes moral virtues for him intellectual virtues. Okay, let's see. Any questions so far? Let me just look and see our chats. Questions. So this is just going to be nice about having something like this, is that I could pause as we're going through these lectures and see if you guys have any questions that I can try to answer for you. Somebody says the stream's cutting out. That could be my reception. Again, we've got very, very poor reception where I live, so I might have to do these later lectures in a place that I have better reception. There's no amount of money that can really fix this because it has nothing to do with upload or download speed, but the box that connects, the ATT box that connects all the internet throughout the apartment is located far away. So it gives everybody bad reception here. Could I post the PowerPoint Discord? Absolutely. It's a great idea. Great idea. So again, the PowerPoint's just slides. Most of the stuff I'm just doing from memory. But let's talk about, because Aristotle mentioned something about happiness, because this can be related to the good life. But it's quite interesting. It means something for him in the classic Greeks, which is very, very, very different than what we moderns and what you see today, what people mean by happiness. So you might hear this. Do what makes you happy. I left the marriage because I wasn't happy. Let me think of other examples. I was feeling happy. Do what makes you feel good. This kind of stuff. Here we have in the modern kind of understanding that happiness is identified with a feeling of pleasure, in Greek, hedon. But the ancient Greeks did not have this notion of happiness associated with feeling. The Greek word for happiness, eudaimonia, eudaimon. No, eudaimonia. It's often translated happiness, but really more precisely, it's human flourishing or well-being. Well, how do you talk about well-being? Let me grab my pumpkin here. Well, is this pumpkin being well? Well, first of all, you have to talk about in the sense of notion of being. The notion of being goes back to this notion of ousia, eidos, like what something is. You can only talk about something as being well or is good. I don't necessarily mean in a moral sense, but is good if you have enough kind of objective conception of what that thing is supposed to be. So if this was all shriveled up, let's say it wasn't orange, like a pumpkin's supposed to be, and these various things, you would say, well, it's not a very good pumpkin. There's no seeds in it, let's say. You're able to identify in terms of its biological function, or telos, that, well, it's not a good pumpkin because it's not fulfilling its nature. Same with a tree or anything biological that has an intrinsic biological essence within nature. It's good or being well insofar as it fulfills that nature. If something impedes it, then you say, well, look, it's not a good orange tree. It's not even producing oranges, or the oranges are all dried up or something like that. And that's because you have, again, an objective essence by which you understand that those material biological parts are supposed to develop into, and it's not doing it. Now, the reason why it's not immoral for doing it, again, it goes back to this notion of rationality and freedom of choice. It's not like the orange tree's going, you know what? I just don't feel like growing oranges. I feel like I'm going to make the choice not to fulfill my nature. Obviously, within the biological kingdom, pumpkins, orange trees, acorns, they neither have rationality to deliberate on how to fulfill their ends, nor the choice to do it. And so we say that they're good or bad strictly within a functional and teleological sense without bringing in the notion of morality. But because you and I are much more than just biological entities, we have rational deliberation. We can understand our natures. We can introspect into what we are, what we ought to be, and then choose to act on that appropriately. That's exactly where morality comes in to play. And so what it means to be happy for Aristotle is not a feeling. It's to be well in and achieve well-being in terms of the fulfillment of your objective nature, who you are, what you are. For Aristotle, and most classic philosophers, your essence is defined as rational animal. And Aristotle tends to get these essential definitions by saying, well, look, locate something's genus, i.e. its general category. Well, what's, and don't go too general, be like, well, what is it? It's stuff. It's like, well, if you get too general, it's going to make it much more difficult to get a nice essential definition. Well, what are we? What's the general category, the genus to which we all belong? Animals, okay? Then Aristotle says, then find within that general category, that genus, what makes this entity specifically different than the rest within that general category. Well, what does that sound like? What makes it specifically different? Species. Genus, species. Who do you think comes up with genus, species? And this taxonomy within biology of classifying things into essentially how they're different from other biological things. It's Aristotle. And so Aristotle looks at all the different animals. And you can too. Think about it. We're an animal, but something makes us specifically different than the rest of the animals. And it's not uprightness. Stand to. We're featherless. Is that what makes, again, you need to get not an accidental difference, but something that's essentially different. And so you don't want to say, well, what is human beingness? Is it featherless biped? We're featherless and we're bipeds. We're walking into, that must be the essential definition of man. That was a classic joke in which somebody, I believe in the Lyceum, took a chicken and plucked all its feathers and then put a sign that said, feathers biped equals human being, and threw it over the school wall of the Lyceum. Just to make the point that, like, clearly that wasn't a great essential definition, because you're pointing out or picking out accidental qualities and not essential qualities. So what essentially makes us different, specifically different than the rest of the animals? It's we possess rationality, which again I'm qualifying as different than intelligence. And you even see this within Homo sapiens, Homo of the same class, the genus, human beings, and then sapientia, wisdom. So the wise animal, that's basically the same thing as saying the rational animal. And so there's going to be a lot of things in that essence that not only determines, our biological ends, but our rational ends, and within that, there's going to be more things I'm going to talk about. It's not just rational. There's implications within the rational realm and domain. But because we have the choice, because we have the rationality to reflect on our objective essence, or form, and we have the choice to act on it, then We can acquire being well and within the domain of ethics and morality and flourish. Now, why do I say that has nothing to do essentially or necessarily with feelings? This is because some of the greatest examples from our faith as Orthodox, speaking from my faith tradition, of human beings par excellence, those human beings that flourish the most, that we use as example, are the saints. And as you'll see here, this is my saint, Saint Ananias. You see him baptizing Saint Paul. And you see him flourishing in his martyrdom, which I don't think anybody's going to say that that's hedon, the pleasure of being tortured and martyred. Who's another classic great saint? Saint Catherine. Were these saints always living a pleasurable life? Is happiness pleasure? Well, if you're hedonist, it is. But we can critique hedonism. But for Aristotle, happiness is human flourishing. And it doesn't necessarily have anything essentially to do with pleasure. Now, you may have joy, but it's different than pleasure. And so I use the saints as examples of people that would be the most happy, and yet they may be in a cell being tortured. And the reason why is because they're fulfilling their nature in the best way possible. Now, what's also really interesting about this too is you're going to see, I think there's a lot that could be salvaged in a practical sense of getting people to reorientate them back to this notion of eudaimonia in the original sense of happiness as being human flourishing. Something that's not simply associated with what you think makes you feel good or what you simply feel. Now, you're going to hear this all throughout the modern world. Do whatever makes you feel happy. Anytime I hear these kind of vague statements, I always try to find a counterexample. So, for example, maybe it's because I'm trained in philosophy, these things just don't make any sense to me at all. They're just so ambiguous and vague. The other day I saw a billboard that says, you be you, which is very similar to do what makes you happy. You might hear, just be true to yourself. What do these things even mean? So my counterexample, for some reason, is always Jeffrey Dahmer. Can you imagine Jeffrey Dahmer's mother saying, Jeffrey, you just be you. Jeffrey, just do what makes you feel good, Jeffrey. What makes you truly happy. Jeffrey, be true to yourself. How absurd is that? And so you got these just platitudes and these things that these people say. They don't even know what they're talking about. They don't reflect on this. They don't have an examined life. And as Socrates says, the examined life is not worth living. Don't be a goofus dummy, right? Or then you're going to start saying stuff that, yes, Jeffrey Dahmer, you be you. Be all you can be, Jeffrey. You go get him, son. This doesn't make any sense. Now, a lot of this is going to be traced back to with what happens in modernity, that specifically with Descartes. Descartes, in his theory of substance dualism, basically says there's only two types of things or substances within the world. res cogitans, the thinking things, which are immaterial, not extended through space. And res extensa, the physical material things that are extended through space. And he identifies what you are, who you are, the soul, an immaterial thinking thing that doubts and thinks, is mind, is the thinking thing. It is not the physical body. Now, as I always like to say, ideas have consequences, and bad ideas have bad consequences. Because think about this. If you have this idea, this philosophy, I am my thoughts, what happens when you acquire mental illness, when you have depression, where your thoughts go wrong? Well, I had a practical example of this where I had a student who's an older student. I mean, not, he's younger than me, but he was, by university standards, a little bit older. And he had served in the Afghanistan war and had lost most of his platoon. And his friends that he did not lose in the war, he lost when coming back, and they'd committed suicide because of PTSD. And this is not an uncommon story. In fact, more people die from their own hands in suicide than actually the casualties in the war. And obviously you can imagine the type of toll that this took on him. And speaking with his parents, that he had spent the last 2-3 years in a fetal position on his floor, screaming and crying, and he couldn't get out of the house, apart from going to the VA, which just pumps you full of medications that just make it worse. And he told me that none of this stuff was working. It was his first semester out, and he's taking Dr. Sorm's Intro to Philosophy class. And I remember going over this lecture, and we were talking about the topic, eudaimonia, as happiness as not being associated with feeling. I was contrasting this with kind of modern notion that you are whatever you think you are. You hear this? You know what? If you have a biological body of a man, but you think inside your head that you are a woman, then that's what you are. You are whatever you think you are. You want to be a goat, right? I guess the only thing that you're not allowed to be is another race, right? Guys, I'm self-identifying as, I don't know, well, let's see. Let's pick a different, whatever the different race is. You can't do that, right? These people don't have a principled position whatsoever. But it doesn't keep them pushing these ideas. Where do they come from? They come from bad principles. That, it's just another form of Gnosticism. That if you are identified with your feelings, if you are identified simply, I am my thoughts, that's who I am, gender is not biological, it's, it's whatever I think it is, it's what I feel, then it's completely relative. There is no objective standard you can be. Now, nobody can live this out consistency, because then what are they going to do? If you disagree with that, they're going to start all of a sudden becoming an objectivist. You're objectively morally incorrect. But I want to go, you're all familiar with this conversation, but I want to go into the mental health realm, because, I'm an advocate for mental illness. I'm part of NAMI, and I've worked with a lot of people suffering from mental illness. And one of them was my student. And, it's interesting, if you've ever experienced depression, clinical depression, or known somebody that's experienced clinical depression, when they are having bad thoughts, when they're not feeling good, when they're melancholic, what do they think about themselves? Who they are? They don't think that they're good or any value. Now think about this in terms of the mentally ill and those who suffer from clinical depression and other mental illnesses. If you're promoting a philosophy and ideology that you are your feelings and that you are your thoughts, what are you telling the people? What message are you giving them when you say, when they're undergoing, clinical depression and they're feeling terrible about themselves, when their thoughts have gone awry? The message you're sending them is, you're not a valuable person. You've gone awry. But from an orthodox anthropology, and even going back to Aristotle, we know we're much more than our thoughts. We're not whatever we feel that we are, whatever we think we are. And so this is a demonic ideology that has very, very negative consequences, especially, not only in the moral realm, where everybody can pick whatever they want and now how many genders there are, but within the realm of mental health and those who are suffering, that we are not helping them by saying, you are your thoughts and your thoughts have gone bad and so you're just a bad person. Like that's all you are. And when we're going over this conversation, I could see that my student who had suffered from this just had this kind of eureka moment and spoke to me after class. And he said, Professor, I can't tell you out of all the years of therapy at the VA what they couldn't do, you were able to do in just this one class. Because he was associating himself with his thoughts. I am my thoughts, and my thoughts are bad, and therefore I'm a bad person. And to be able to hear that eudaimonia isn't essentially feelings or thoughts, but human flourishing, and that one could flourish and be well, and be truly happy, and feel bad. One could undergo depression and still be an objectively good human being, had completely changed and overthrown his previous worldview and began to heal him. So we have to think about these. It's not just an intellectual game that we're just going, well, what intellectual paradigm? I want to take the Cartesian, or I want to take... It's not an intellectual game. It has actual pragmatic and very, very real consequences in people's lives. And so as clergy, this is why I'm concerned with ideas, knowing what bad ideas are, what bad arguments are, and what good arguments are, and what truth is distinguished from falsehood. Because primarily the reason is it's not an intellectual game. It's because I'm ultimately concerned with people's lives out of love for all human beings, and I want to heal people. And I can't heal people, and none of us can heal people, if we're giving them bad medicine, things that are making them sick. Think about an addict. Is it loving to give them what they want, what makes them feel good? It's not loving, but this is what the modern world gives. And so I think there's something really beautiful in that we can return back to some of these classic ancient notions, like happiness in terms of eudaimonia, human flourishing, in contrast with the modern notion. And we can develop a therapia, a healing, especially within the Orthodox faith. We have this. And so I thought I'd share that with you, that this is just kind of a practical application of some of these things. Why is it important? Is this just all, intellectual games? It's not. It has a real effect on people's lives, and we should care about that. We should care about the truth, and we should ultimately care about each other and their well-being. We want all to flourish as human beings. And so let me just put back up to the slide here. And what Aristotle talks about is, and maybe this is kind of the influence of his teacher, Plato, is that obviously he has a notion of the objective good. And in the Nicomachean Ethics, he says that good that you're seeking must be perfect by comparison with all other ends. This is, for me, reminiscent of his teacher Plato, the form of the good. What is it that makes all things good? And what is it that you seek is not just things, but the standard which is good. And therefore, obviously not as the good understood teleologically, it's never used. You know, there's this distinction between use and enjoyment. Enjoyment is the sense of, or the ends. Wanting something for as an end, desiring it for its own sake, or as a means. Yes, there are some things that you desire as a means. Currency, money. Now, wouldn't it be strange if you said, well, why do you desire money? Because I like it. Well, why? Because I like collecting it. So you don't want to use it for anything? No. You know that's kind of a perverse and weird answer. That, well, currency is not meant to be just collected. It's to be used for other things that are hopefully good, as a means to another end. Now imagine on the converse, why do you love your mother and father? Because they're a means to my end. They're giving me a house and money. You'd know, again, that's a perverse. There's certain things that go in within the category of means and certain things as ends. And Aristotle's obviously identifying that the good that we're understanding as teleologically must be an end. You're seeking it, you're not using it for something else. Why? Because it's perfect beyond all comparison with all other ends. So it's self-sufficient, and it's never for the sake of something else. It's an end in its own right. Now, when you desire and try to achieve that perfect end that's self-sufficient, it makes life worthwhile. Why? Because it lacks nothing. When you would try to achieve the perfect end, perfect by all, by comparison to all other goods, by which you seek for its own sake, well, by definition, it lacks nothing. And your attempt to acquire that objectively is exactly what makes life worth living. So, back to the question. Eudaimonia and the good life. Well, what is the good life? Well, in the Nicomachean Ethics, he's got 3 choices here for you. Is it wisdom? 1. 2, virtue. Or 3, pleasure. Well, got a bit of a false setup here for you, a bit of a trick, because it's not an either or. Aristotle connects all 3 to happiness. But he distinguishes, first of all, what he means by a state. The Greek word's hexis, so you see I've got this slide up here. He distinguishes a state from its use, charis, or energeia, exercise, activity. Now, I'm going to give you an example of what he means by this. So you can be in a particular state, mathematical or musical. I'm going to think of the examples Aristotle uses. So you can acquire the state of being musical, and in virtue of acquiring the state of being musical, you can use that. You can exercise. This has to do with first and second actuality, various things. But I'm not going to get too far into that. I just want to kind of state the obvious that I can learn mathematics and acquire the state of becoming knowledgeable in mathematics or music, and that's different from using it. Then I can exercise that knowledge and reveal, right? Now I'm playing the music. Now I'm working out the mathematics. And so Aristotle is using this with regard to ethics as well. And what he says, going back to those three options, wisdom, virtue, and pleasure, he states that virtue and wisdom are states of character. And as we know, to get a state of character, you have to practice. So how do you become wise? You have to engage wise in activities that will make you wise. What about virtue? How do you become in a state, a hexis, virtue? Well, you avoid vice is one thing. Don't vice. And you practice virtue. Why? This is this is how you acquire a state of character. But happiness, he says, you might have thought, well, isn't happiness a state of character too? It's not. Happiness is always an activity. It's an activity that flows out of these two states of character, virtue and wisdom. That's why previously, in the previous slides, I had showed that he immediately connected, intellectual virtues with morality. That the two are linked, and they're linked here through acquiring a state of character of being virtuous and wise. And they'll work together such that once you've acquired and you are that type of person, i.e. virtuous and wise, that when you act, that is the exercise by which we call is human flourishing. And you can kind of think about this too in terms of, could the oak tree, orange tree flourish if it did not act and do and grow? Well, it's even more so with human beings. Therefore, happiness can't simply be identified with either one of them. We need to get to the notion of pleasure, though. And this is basically, he thinks pleasure is the unimpeded exercise of that appropriate state. And you'll see this here by the slide that I put up for you. How does Aristotle's view of nature and forms relate to the good life? So remember, coming back on our original point, the starting point is Aristotle's particular view of nature. This particular view of nature was of forms. Remember? His objective, what we are. But the activity that constitutes happiness, as we point out, is use or exercise. That's why, you can imagine that you've acquired, let's say you've trained your whole life to do something, and then you are put in solitary confinement. You've been training your whole life to play this, become this amazing musician. And you're going to do this recital that's going to blow away the world. And you get locked up in solitary confinement. They impede your exercise. Well, under that situation, in those circumstances, there's no way that you can be happy. Now, obviously, you're feeling bad. You have no pleasure. And that's because, as you see here, you have something impeding the exercise of that. And you can't be happy because even though you've acquired the state of character of being musical, you cannot exercise it. And exercise is always within. Happiness is always an exercise, a doing, an activity. So wisdom, now within the moral realm of the good life, wisdom and moral virtue, now they're different states of character. But it's interesting, they act in a symphony, in a synergy. They're exercised inseparably in a single activity, energeia. So what you see is not that they're competing, but they're all collaborating together. The collaborating contributions to happiness. So Aristotle claims that, remember going back to here, what is the good life? Is it wisdom, virtue, or pleasure? It's going to require all three. So states a character. Well, where does pleasure come in? Because happiness is an activity, that means that pleasure is identical with the unimpeded exercise of an appropriate state. So that happiness considered is the unimpeded exercise of those two states. What are they? Wisdom and virtue. Is simultaneous the life of virtue, the life of wisdom, and it can involve pleasure. So Aristotle, again going back to the beginning about his conception of nature, believes that human beings, all of nature has natural forms, including human beings, that functions teleological, right? And this is a life concerned with action. We're doers, right? We exercise these characters of wisdom and virtue through action. And the activity of the soul. The soul is the life of the physical body for Aristotle. It's not a substance dualist notion. It's not an immaterial substance separate from the body, but it's the very life of the physical body, the anima. And that's actually your essence, it's your form. It includes reason. It includes the biological animal part as well. But that's a human being. Goodwill, thus human goodwill is, what is this? To be a good human being in terms of functioning and activity, that is the activity of the soul in accordance with virtue. So for Aristotle, fulfilling of human nature is living the good life based on everything that we've said thus far. Okay, now what I want to do is turn to the moderns. So we've kind of summed up, and by the way, let me just end real quick that it's not just that Aristotle thinks that rational animality, that is, what constitutes a human being is simply just the rational animal part, but there's something further to that. The part of your soul, your anima, your form, that makes even the very physical parts of your body, all your biological parts, come together for a particular anima, telos, is at a biological level and a rational level, but within the realm of the rational is the communal. That Aristotle believes that man is essentially a communal animal, a relational animal. That no man's an island, that our form, our essence and soul, what makes us be objectively what we are, is not just to be doing philosophy and mathematics on an island somewhere, but it's to live in community. One indication of this is look at your own biology. Your biology produces family, other members. And families come together to form villages in the polis. You know, even within orthodoxy we know this. You know, people might think as an objection, yeah, but what about the hermits? Don't they live as an island unto themselves. No, they don't. They still live attached to a community. They have their food brought to them. Now, their schedule of visiting and interacting with the community might be much different than those within the actual monastery grounds themselves, or us within the city, but they're still linked to community. They get visits, they come down. Their schedule is just different. Now, we know what happens to people when they actually do live like an island, completely separated and abolish any sense of community. They turn mad, they turn into animals. They lose their rationality. And attempting to be rational and move out as an island separated from all, they lose the very thing that they so wanted, rationality. They become beasts. So we know that, something essentially part of us that makes us what we are is we're communal animals that are involved in rational activities within the community as a whole. We're together, and that bonds all of us. We share an objective form and essence that is both rational and communal. Now we're going to see that's going to be quite different with the moderns. So let's look at our old. Now again, Immanuel Kant is at the end. Let's go. At the end tail of modernity, early modernity being marked by Descartes, and Kant, the end part being the enlightenment. Then there's post-modernity, post-modernity. Now, where you want to delineate these, it's not really important, but it kind of gives us a general category for conceiving commonalities within thought through particular eras. Now, yes, Immanuel Kant is a modern. And so one of the things, as I brought up earlier, that the moderns do, starting with Descartes, is they reject natural forms or essences to exist within the sensible world, the res extensa. So what Descartes does is a mechanization of nature. And all the rest of the moderns will embrace this as well. And you get this through the empiricists, Locke, Hume. Immanuel Kant falls up on Hume, accepting the exact same thing as well. Now, I'm trying to remember, I wanted to get a quote for you off the top of my head. Anyways, I'll remember it later and bring it up. Now, one of the things is they thought that, it's kind of be a redefining of what knowledge is in terms of kind of a pragmatism. That if it does not produce anything, then it's useless. Why do you need an explanation if it doesn't do anything? And so you're going to have the similar thing with, look, teleology and natural forms don't do anything as far as predicting. They're inert, as far as that's concerned. And so we should reject it. Now they're going to reject the notion of material cause as well. So you get rid of formal cause, you get rid of obviously teleological cause, There's no you don't. If you get rid of formal causes, you're getting rid of teleology as well. But material cause should be gotten abolished as well, because that's just a given. Again, it's not that matter does anything. Matter is just the given. What does something is efficient causality. It's forces. Why can't I remember that quote? It's driving me crazy. And so what you get here is matter and motion. So matter is not a cause, but you just have efficient mechanistic causality. Now that's going to simplify things quite a bit. And it's going to be real nice for science. So now I don't have to think through formal causes and teleology. What I can do now is simply just use cause and effect within efficient mechanistic causalities, force and vectors upon material atoms and objects within the material world to then predict exactly where everything is going to go in terms of force and mechanistic causation in a uniform manner. And that provides a very simple and beneficial, in some sense, view for science, but there's obviously going to be other consequences. Now, what we see is with Immanuel Kant, since he has embraced this, and you're going to see this within his critique of pure reason. One of the problems is that, so here's this critique of pure reason. From David Hume, he understood something, and from David Hume's skepticism, something really important. And that is that if there's no forms in nature, if it's just matter and motion, what David Hume and Kant also call the sense manifold. So nothing's connected. There's no apples or oranges out there, or pumpkins or trees. It's just motion. It's just matter and forces. And you're completely restricted to your sense impressions. Well, David Hume takes you through his philosophical adventure and shows that you can't know anything. You don't sense causality. You sense one thing after another in sense of temporal succession. But just because, for example, the second hand on the watch hits 3 and a person walks in the door, isn't it erroneous to assume that, well, my God, the second hand hitting 3 causes the person to walk through the door? Correlation does not equal causation. And so likewise with temporal succession, just because all you're observing, since there's no form, there's no notion of causality that you can observe within your empirical sensation, you don't know things are causing other things to happen. And it gets worse. It gets to where you can't even know identity over time. Why there's no form to, right? You're just restricted to, you're left in this kind of radical skepticism. And Immanuel Kant in the Critique of Pure Reason realizes that, well, if there's no causality, there's no science. So we've got a big problem here. And so mainly people think that the Critique of Pure Reason is Kant's just simple epistemological project to save knowledge and science. But as we'll see, that his epistemological project's really for his moral project. This is called Kant's Copernican Revolution. So what you see here is 2 models I put up on the slide of you might be familiar with. On the left, you have the geocentric model, the old Ptolemaic model. So you see the Earth in the middle with the Moon, Mercury, Venus, the Sun, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn all tracing around, and then think you have the different zodiacs going on the different you can see the different zodiacs on the outer rings like that, the outer concentric circles. And then what's the other paradigm? Copernicus, in which you have a heliocentric universe. So the sun's the center, and now you see the planets on the earth moving around the sun. Now, people often get this mistaken. They think that we moved from a geocentric to a heliocentric based on evidence. We just acquired enough evidence and built up our science to know better. Wrong! That's not how science works, and if you don't believe me, read Thomas Kuhn's Scientific Revolution and start studying up on the philosophy of science. Evidence only means evidence within a given paradigm that you assume. And so the switch between the old geocentric universe of Ptolemy to Copernicus' heliocentric universe is not based on evidence. Paradigm always comes first. It's a paradigm shift. It's a revolution. Out with the old regime, in with the new. It's a coup d'etat, guys. We've got a coup going on here, and it's not based on evidence. It might be based on other things that motivate that, much like a revolution or a conversion to some different political ideology or something like that, is Kuhn brings up. But it's a big what if. Well, what if it was rather we weren't, obviously, it wasn't the Earth that's the center. So our point of view is not from the Earth as the center. But what if we played our reference? What if we had the sun in the center, heliocentric, and our reference point was on the sun? Would things look different? Oh yeah, they would. They would look a lot different. Why? Because again, there is no neutral evidence across paradigms. Paradigms and your assumptions within your paradigm and worldview color the way that you see things. Everything will look different. And we see this here. In the geocentric universe, we have the planets moving around the Earth, and you have something called epicycles because of something called retrograde motion. Now that's going to be explained completely differently, and things are going to look a lot different within the heliocentric universe. If you assume that paradigm, you switch it out, do the revolution, well, you're not going to have epicycles. You don't need them. So in one sense, you could prefer the Copernican system because the rule of parsimony, you're not violating Occam's razor of multiplying causes, having two circles as causes, two causes, rather than one. So it might be a reason to prefer it, but has nothing to do with truth. Your paradigm makes things look different. Now, why am I bringing this up? And it's because Kant is given this kind of title, a Copernican revolution. Whereas in the old regime, in the old paradigm, we thought of forms existing in the world. And how did we know things? Well, because, as Aristotle said, your mind and the thing known become one. Not copies, but your mind actually knows the form that makes the apple be an apple is now in your mind, not as a copy, but the actual form. And its form, whether it's for Plato or Aristotle, that's the principle of knowledge. Everybody knows that. But modernity rejects that. It throws out the old regime. It does a revolution. And Kant does a Copernican revolution. Now, where do the forms go? They're not in nature. They go in the mind. Forms of the mind, he says, belong only to the form of intuition. And that's not intuition like hunch. That means something very specific in Kant. What makes possible experience. Intuition is basically the necessary conditions that make possible experience and knowledge. So the forms of the mind belong only to the form of intuition and therefore to the subjective constitution of our mind, without which these predicates, what predicates? Well, when I'm saying the apple's green is a predicate, could not be ascribed to anything, i.e. the apple, at all. And that is from Kant's Transcendental Aesthetic in his critique of pure reason. So now look at my new slide. Where are the forms? They're not out there. There is no pool table. There are no billiard balls out there. All you have is simply a manifold of sense experience, of sense data. It's unconnected. We don't even know what it is out there. David Hume shows that. There's nothing you can know about that. Ain't nobody got time for that. By the way, that is David Hume with the pool stick saying, "Your shot, sir. Your shot, sir." And Immanuel Kant saying, "Well, I'm thinking. Take it easy, man. Take it easy, David Hume. I'm thinking right now. I'm thinking through my 12 a priori categories in my mind, the totality of, you go through all the different of unity. Now, all of those are going to be organized under the a priori categories of space and time." So Immanuel Kant's going to say, look, there's not even space and time out there. They're simply just the necessary conditions, a priori conditions within your mind, based on the subjective constitution of your mind, that makes possible your experience of what you call a pool table and a man named David Hume saying, "Good, your shot, sir." So, I also put this funny slide up here. Collect them all, philosophical action figures. We got Immanuel Kant right here with Copernican revolution, action. Why? Because he spins. His head spins, changing the direction of epistemological fit from mind world to world mind. Did you not know that? If you guys ever find any more of these action figures, I do want to collect them all. I think that'd be pretty cool. But that's just to liven up our philosophical conversation with philosophical powers. Well, he also has this thing in Kant's Transcendental Idealism called the noumenal and phenomenal distinction. Remember, because there are no forms out there, we actually don't even know what the world is actually in itself. He calls that the noumenal. Reality in itself. Ding und sich in German, the thing in itself. Well, that's beyond the world of appearances. And guess what, guys? According to Immanuel Kant, it's epistemologically or epistemically inaccessible to us. Now, what is accessible to you is the phenomenal world of appearances, things as they appear to you. The physical world of the sense manifold. Now, you might ask the question, as rightly you should, well, if I can't experience the noumenal world, why should I think it exists? Because something must cause the phenomenal world. And so, although you only have access epistemically to the phenomenal world, it is the noumenal world that's the cause of that. And again, what you're experiencing the phenomenon is nothing probably like what's actually in the world itself. Now modern science kind of has a conception of this. If you think about, for example, color. How does modern science describe blue? Would they say that, okay, so we typically identify colors as qualities. That's weird. Put this on I guess that's right. I got 2 black pens. I got a blue pen with a blue... Here we go. Here's what I've done wrong. I'll mix my black on my blue. So, blue. We experience that as a quality, qualitatively. But what does modern science say? What is blue? Or what is red? Is redness, is that quality actually in that thing according to modern science? No. It's 600 nanometer wavelength. So again, it's just, there's no quality of redness or blueness within the objects. It's simply molecules of matter in motion at a certain wavelength that produces the phenomenal experience within them. Or likewise, I could also say if I went and grabbed the habanero pepper out of the kitchen right over here and took a bite of that, and my goodness, my mouth has reached 240 degrees Fahrenheit, and you take a thermometer and you put it in my mouth, is my mouth actually 240 degrees Fahrenheit? No. Then you put the thermometer in the chili pepper. Is the chili pepper 240 degrees Fahrenheit? No, it's not. There is no quality of 240 degrees, or the quantity of 240 degrees within the thing. But what it is doing is that whatever the acids or something that's going on in the pepper, it's causing a phenomenal experience within me, and the phenomenal experience is not within the object. So you have somewhat of a parallel. The only difference is we'd say, I mean, I wouldn't, but some would say that, but we know actually what's in the pepper causing that, and it's the acid. We actually know what but according to Kant, we don't know the noumenal world. Now, why is he bringing up this distinction? Why does he need to bring up this distinction between a noumenal and a phenomenal world? Well, that's because I said earlier that his epistemological project, so once he solves the problem of epistemology, and he's able to save our boy Newton. By the way, I just realized that when I pulled up the icon last time I was saying Ananias and Newton, that we had it still on the slideshow so you can see it. Now you can. So, by the way, there's St. Ananias being martyred. Like I said, not a pleasurable experience, but achieved full happiness and human flourishing. And Sir Isaac Newton here, that he's finally able to save science because he's able to save and redefine knowledge on his own terms, right? Through the Copernican revolution, by positing a priori categories of space-time based on the subjective constitution of our mind, and nothing out there in the world is forms. Forms are now in the mind. The revolution. But how does that come back to Kant's transcendental idealism with making the distinction of noumenal and phenomenal world? Why does he need to do that? My hunch is because his epistemological project's really for his ethical project. Why? Because if I just pop up this slide here, science and causality is in the phenomenal world. And it's causally determined. Now remember, I said previously that Kant had said every ought, which is a moral imperative, every ought implies a can. Morality implies freedom. Well, great job, Kant. You saved epistemology for us and got us science back with mechanistic causality, and now we've lost freedom and morality. Do you see where I'm going with this? that it's like that cartoon where you get a leak in the dam and you put your finger in one part of the dam and it starts popping out another part of the dam. You solve one problem to make only another one. And so what he does by pausing the noumenal and phenomenal world is that, look, yes, science is done within the noumenal world. This is the world of your appearances that you see is causally determined. But the noumenal world, the world in itself, this is the one aspect in the noumenal world that you have access to. Freedom. The freedom to decide the goodwill a priori through the use of reason. So that's why he's making that distinction. With regard to everything else, epistemically, you have no access to the noumenal world. But with freedom, you have access to the noumenal world. So he's making that distinction again. His epistemological project for his ethical project. Well, let's get to Kant's ethics. So I'm setting up again Kant's particular notion of both what is nature, what's a sense, manifold. There are no natural forms. And therefore he's going to have to redefine knowledge. Well, obviously it's going to have implications on the way he answers what ethics is, what reason, what morals are. So what's Kant's ethical outlook? Well, you can't appeal to common essences and forms within human beings anymore, can you? Because we've rejected that as moderns. Not me personally, but personifying modernity. We have spoken and we have rejected forms existing in nature. So you can't appeal to that. Well, he says, and this is going to reveal something. He says that, and he's always emphasizing that law-like structures. Well, what is law? It's always in a conditional. Conditional in logic is an if-then. If X, then Y. And so you have this kind of epistemically too with Kant. If you experience, let's say, a certain wavelength, then produce Y, the phenomenal world. But you need another condition for something to be law-like. So, for example, if you see the red light, then stop. And then somebody says, well, that's just for all of you plebs, but for me, Father Deacon Ananias, I don't have to do. You know I was absurd or insane. No, you have to. You're nobody special. You have to stop as well. So law is, it's conditional. If the red light, then stop for all. So that's really, again, will apply as law-like structures to epistemology. If this comes in at a certain wavelength, the sense manifold, then produce this phenomenal experience of red. For you, and not me, no, across, law. Reconnection successful. We are back after they shut down the internet. I've always worried about that happening. Is what if the internet goes down? What if... Is it up? Can you see it? Give me a thumbs up. It says it's reconnected, but I'm trying to see a visual on the... What's that? Let me get your chat back up, guys. I apologize for the interruption. Anything? Yay! Okay, we're back. So my apologies, the internet went down, but we can return back to our previously canceled broadcast. Okay, we were talking about Kant's ethics and the moral law. And a question that comes up in morality is, what makes an action morally worthy? Well, what do you think Kant's going to say? What are you going to say, Kant? Kant's going to say, if it was done for the right reason. Well, as you can anticipate, what is the right reason? What's Kant going to answer now? Ooh, gotcha, Kant. What's the right reason? The right reason, Kant's going to say, is it was required by duty. So if you think back on our previous example of why do you stop at the red light? Because it's the law. So you do the right thing and you're morally, at least legally doing the right thing, the right action. If you do stop at the red light, you're doing the right thing. Well, why is it the right thing? Because it's the law. It's duty. So law's always put in sense of duty. There's no other reason than it's the law. And the law is a conditional of if X then Y for all. And so if you do that, your action's worthy because you're doing it for the right reason. And the right reason is because it's required by duty. It's the law. It's not going to change when it comes to Kant talking about the moral law. An action is morally worthy if it's done for the right reason, and the right reason is it's required by duty. So a praiseworthy action is performed because it's in accordance with the moral law. Now this gets to what he calls the categorical imperative. Kant's categorical imperative. The categorical imperative is a type of master moral law. So it basically says you should always act in a way that's truly law-like. Well, what does that mean? Well, when you act, you should act in a way that's universalizable. Did you want everybody else to act in that way too? There you go. Everyone else, all, universal. In other words, when you act, Kant believes there's an implicit rule that you are following. And this is your maxim. And so what the categorical imperative says is you should always act on a maxim that is universalizable. You might know so that's kind of the positive version. Always act in a way that you'd want everybody else to act. That's a maxim that's universalizable. Here is in the negative format. Never act in a way that you wouldn't want everybody else to act. That's a categorical imperative. Why? Because you're acting in a way that's universalizable. So don't contradict yourself and act in one way. Let's say, I think it's okay to steal people's car. Well, then you're acting on a maximum that you would wish everybody else would just steal people's cars as well. So there's a sort of kind of logical consistency, but that's also law-like, and it's law-like because it's an if-then that's in a universalizable explanation. One of the other ways to understand the categorical imperative is, well, you don't treat humans as means only. You treat them as ends. And why? Well, because you want to be treated as a means, act in a way that, no, I want to be treated as an end. Remember we talked about my parents? Why do you love your parents? Because they're a means or an end. The right answer, in case you don't know, everybody, is because they're an end. They're lovable in their own right. They're not used for anything. That is the correct answer, just in case you didn't know. And yes, we're doing an ethics course now, so in case you don't know, now you know. And so, you should treat all people as an end. Act on a maxim that you could decree as a universal law. So I already kind of gave an example that I don't steal and I don't lie because I'm acting on a maxim that I'm decreeing that I want everybody to act the same way. Don't lie and don't steal. Now, somebody could maybe anticipate an objection that, well, what if you're just some type of sicko? It's like, you know what? I like it when people punch me in the face. I wish that everybody punch people in the face because that's what I like. Well, notice this third condition here that kind of solves that. That's not rational, Kant would say. So act on a maxim that every other rational person would accept. Now, maybe that just pushes the question back farther. Well, who's rationality? Who constitutes what's the rational person versus what's not? Well, of course, Immanuel Kant does in his Critique of Pure Reason, sillies. Don't you know? So you can challenge that. I'm just bringing up a possible objection. So, on to Kant. Morality and freedom. Now, notice he's a just do it kind of dude. So I put it up there. Just do it. Why do I gotta obey the law? Just do it. Why is it about just do it? Why do it? When you act for what duty requires, you are acting independently of desires that arise in you by nature. So when Kant doesn't want emotions to get into, for example, think about the whole lying thing. If you have a categorical imperative, it's always wrong to lie. Why? Because if you said, yeah, but in this case, I kind of needed the money and I had to lie to her, I was going to get fired from my job or something like that. And so that's understandable, right? Well, then you're basically saying, what are you doing? First of all, you're letting your desires arise in you and cloud your rationality. Because the rational is tied in with that law-like structure that's universalizable. Well, then it means that everybody can use their passions and desires to determine when they can actually lie and not lie. So one way Kant solves this problem is through the categorical imperative. That when you act for what duty requires, based on rational dictates alone, you're eliminating the desire. And that's going to apply equally to everybody and set a sort of standard. You are acting on the basis of reason. And this is true freedom, he thinks. Why? Because, well, obviously, you've heard the Plato talk about oftentimes when you lead by your passions, Plato has a famous phrase, too much freedom is actually slavery. Well, how does that doesn't make any sense, Plato. What are you talking about? Well, think about it. Do what thou wilt. You want to do heroin and drink every night and look at pornography and stuff like that. You are free to do that. You have the free will. But what about that freedom? Too much of it will lead to what? You freely engage in that, and soon you'll find yourself in a place that you're no longer free. You can't resist. You're a slave. And that's why Plato's saying that, too much freedom is going to mean slavery. And maybe Kant realizes this too. Doing what you think is right rather than be a slave to your desires means that you're not being driven around by natural forces and your passions. And so true freedom lies in just do it. Do the duty. Act on the basis of reason alone. Get your passions and desires out of it. They will make you a slave. Now, the classic objection, though, is, well, what happens when the Nazis come to the door? Das Heiden Judens? Uh-oh. If you're Kantian, what are you going to do? What are you going to say? What does the categorical imperative say? What does the law say? What is the duty? Thou shalt not lie. Well, but in this situation, no, that's to get your passions involved. So you have to, as much as it pains you, go, yeah, they're hiding behind the bookcase. But guys. Now, something rubs us intuitively wrong about that. And you've probably heard different people answer that in different ways. You might say, well, it's just a bad situation all around. Of course, you're never to lie. But you shouldn't be involved in turning people over to be killed or whatever. Maybe it's not the Gestapo. Maybe it's the FBI. Just imagine whatever scenario you want on this. Do the right thing. Well, what's the right thing when you have two bad options? And so somebody might say, well, look, you just got to choose the lesser of two evils. You weren't presented with the... There is another way out. We Orthodox know this. St. Basil says in situations like that, you must lie. It's a flat-out denial of Kant's categorical imperative. Why? Because remember what Christ says? What Christ says that all of the law and the prophets are summed up in the law. And the law, summed up in the rule of charity. And the rule of charity is to love your God with all your heart, mind, and soul, and to love your neighbor as yourself. So, excuse me, I misspoke. When Christ said that all of the law and prophets are summed up in love, what we're seeing there is that the law is a means, it's not an end. And the law, whether it's canon law or the moral law, is a means to some end. What's the end? Well, Christ tells us it's love. Love of God with all your heart, mind, and soul, and love of neighbor as self. So what happens when the law ends up coming in contradiction or going against its very purpose of what it's trying to achieve? Its end, love. So if you're to love your neighbor, you don't do something bad, but the law says you're not supposed to lie. Well, the law is contradicting itself at that point. Because the law is just a means, it's not an end. Kierkegaard had a name for this: the teleological suspension of the ethical. We Orthodox have economia, and it's based on this principle that it's not getting passions involved or something like that, but it's understanding that, again, law is a means and not an end, and it's a means to the end of love, and if those two should ever come into contradiction, then the law would be forfeiting its very own nature and contradicting itself, and so you suspend the law for the sake of the end, that the end might not be sacrificed, and the end is love. So that's one kind of objection to Immanuel Kant. Again, we see this in Soren Kierkegaard with the teleological suspension of the ethical, who, very interesting, is responding to Kant, people like Kant and the German idealists and whatnot, in this kind of rationalization, this ultra-rationalism that, Kierkegaard thinks, look, ethics isn't like that. These unique situations, it's always concerning this, the individual within and not this universalizable maxim that you act on. But as we see, Kant has his reasons, and his reasons are Well, he kind of starts from those starting points. He's led to conclude the way he does. And he thinks that, again, that you don't have a form that binds us together. You can't appeal to human nature and fulfilling one's nature teleologically. Well, what do you have? You only have the a priori categories of intuition, and they operate causally in a law-like structure, and therefore morality must be tied to that as well, and you act on the basis of reason, which is law-like, the duty, just do it. And when you do that in a universalizable way, just like law, then you're separating your desires from the situations of acting, and acting truly rationally is to act in the most free way. Freedom! So let's just summarize. We've been going for a while. Two different views of the good life. To recap. Why? Because there's two different presuppositions and starting points, two different paradigms. So they're going to answer things differently. For Aristotle, the notion of the good life, we saw, presupposed a view of nature. A particular view of nature that possessed natural forms, essences, or forms as essence within the world, as natural forms, living essences. You and I have that. Number two, a certain view of causality within nature with an emphasis on teleology. Three, a definite human form. You and I have a definite human form or essence that is defined in accordance not only with its biological features, so our form, our soul, our anima is obviously not only just determining how our body will develop, but it also includes our rational faculties. And four, a notion of the good as an end in its own right, which is the activity of the human soul in accordance with reason. So remember, its activity is what achieves happiness. Remember, we spelled that in terms of the notion of a good as an end in its own right, and we act in accordance with reason. But we also pointed out that since part of man's nature, according to Aristotle, is essentially social, both man's activities, the virtues he or she requires, and the life of reason, and the state of character of wisdom one would acquire, are to be carried out within community. Kant, on the other hand, from the modern perspective, in the enlightenment, had a very different notion of nature, a particular modern conception of nature. And that included a denial of natural forms and essences within the world, the external world. And three, therefore, a rejection of a common telos. There's nothing that makes us common and firm in terms, all men are equal. We hear that. But you can't appeal to a natural form or essence in the world that makes us all materially be equal as human beings. There's no common telos. A teleology there's also a rejection of the teleology within our form as an essential connection to the polis. So if we're not connected in a natural form and share a unity of being within the world itself, and if part of that natural form is to be essentially communal and carried out socially together, then you also have a rejection of an essential and natural connection to the polis, social community. So the good life for Kant leaves man, as I argue, isolated, existing as an island. Well, what binds him? Simply just being guided under duty, under a priori dictates according to reason within a universal law or rule. One of the reasons why I bring this up is that I had said countless times to my students, we don't just end up places in history accidentally. That again, ideas have consequences, ideas have bad consequences. And what we see today is that the emergence through social media and the new technology, that all of this was sold to us on the idea of connectedness. That we're going to connect. It's social, the social media, technology. We'll have more information that brings us all together, and we'll all be, one world community, one currency, one world. And yet, it has just the opposite effects. That people are more broken and disconnected, isolated. Depression is higher than we've ever seen. The rates of suicide higher than we've ever seen in history, especially among the youth, who are the biggest consumers of this social media and new technology. And did it just happen? It doesn't just happen. It comes from certain ideas, certain philosophical ideas. And what you see in the ancient world is very different than the modern world. Is you really see in the ancient world a kind of organic unity between both man, nature, the family, the polis, the empire, God. There's very much an organic unity. Why? Because they had a particular conception of nature that was able to make that cohere, to explain how that worked, and kept people within that cohesion. They had a philosophical explanation for their unity with one another, ontologically speaking. But as we see with Immanuel Kant, because he embraces modernity, and the modern conception of nature is to remove any objective essences in nature. Well, then what do you have? You have this sort of kind of rational world. Everything has to be explained in terms of like kind of Descartes' rationalism. And from there it's carried out a critique of rationalism, where it goes into empiricism, right? And then a critique of empiricism. We're left with skepticism from David Hume. And then you get Immanuel Kant, which you have this kind of synergy between a kind of a rational empiricism, right? But again, through this whole thread of modernity, you don't see any objective essences within nature, physis. There's no, ontological unity within the world. We're all within our mind. We're separated now, subject and object, i.e. the world, are now separated. There is a goal. So not only is knowledge redefined, but what it means to be a human being, and to be a human being together. And so all that Kant has at that point to work with is, again, law-like a priori structures. And what happens, and this is supposed to be rational, but what happens when postmodernity comes in and critiques rationality? When you get this in Rorty talks about this, and you get this sort of kind of relativism. At least modernity and the Enlightenment had this sort of optimism that it was end all wars, that it would bring all together, like all nations together, end all religious disputes, that you have this kind of universal religion, universal mankind. This is where you get secular humanism from. It was optimistic, but it can't be carried out. Why? Because it starts from false starting points. And false starting points will lead you to wrong conclusions. And wrong conclusions will have very practical implications upon humanity, both individually and socially. And one of the things is, once you critique reason, like I said, who defines the dictates of reason? Immanuel Kant, the critique of pure reason. Well, once that's critiqued and you're left in kind of postmodernity's, Richard Rorty's relativism, there is nothing left other than power structures. right? Nietzsche is correct to point this out. And so what you get is then, therefore, not only in postmodernity, a kind of nihilistic hopelessness and despair, because the Enlightenment failed. Everybody knows that. It has not solved, it's brought about more wars and disease and problems and discord among people, and it has left people more isolated than ever. And so now what we have is, again, based on this history of thought through modernity. There is no objective truth. There is no essence to bind us. There's nothing to bind us. All that there is power and manipulation from technocratic elites, technocratic tyranny. You have it being sold that this is supposed to connect you, but it's not. It's divisive, as a whole, and kind of in net consequences. And you have to ask yourself, well, how did we get here? How is it that we can all be so connected and yet so isolated? Because natural means of communication and unity have been replaced with unnatural ones. And this is what's important about studying the history of philosophy, is that you're able to trace out bad things that are happening right now didn't just happen. They happened because there was a whole series of dominoes in a causal chain that happened because of particular ideas. And this is one thing that I hope to share with all of you, is in studying the history of ideas and the history of philosophy, and always understanding this within the orthodox paradigm of what is absolute truth. We're able to see not only how we've gotten to these bad ideas and where we are, but actually potential solutions to many of the problems as well. So I hope that that's you've enjoyed tonight's lecture on ethics. I know I promised you that. Let's just take a few questions from the chat, guys. How many hours have we been doing? 2 hours? Okay, let's go from bottom up, shall we? Does anybody want to throw any questions in before we end tonight? Yeah, that could be true, but Ayn Rand. Let's see. How many people? 23 watching. I think we're up to 30. I didn't give an announcement. I probably would have gotten more live. Again, I was kind of experimenting with if I could get all this stuff to work with the OBS. We had a couple hiccups, but I think in the end, it turned out okay, and I'll know what to work on in the future. Thank you, okay. Appreciate that support. Yes, and I had somebody reach out too. I may just do a full stream about the issues of mental illness, understanding them properly, understanding them within an orthodox perspective as well, and how that we can all work on helping one another in all of our struggles. What else, guys? Questions? One of my talks, future talks I could do on apophaticism, kind of relating to transcendental arguments. That might be something nice. I know I have an AMA scheduled for that. I'll make an announcement so we can get more people on to just ask me whatever they want. Let's see. How likely do you think it is that we will develop a healthy orthodox ethic, kill, lead criminals, and heal? We hear a lot about it times, but how likely do you think? Well, we don't need to develop it. We already actually have a healthy orthodox ethic. And again, it's always a synergy with people. And it's kind of a mystery how that works. But everybody has free will of how they want to, respond to. And I'm telling you, I've been mistaken so many times where I've said that, like, this person is beyond reform, and a miracle happens. And it's always through orthodoxy that I've seen. And I stand corrected. I'm happy to be wrong. And I'm definitely happy to be wrong at the benefit of other people. And so, again, all we need to do is just, the formula's there. We have the fullness of faith within orthodoxy. We know what happens to people when they work the program. Look at the saints and the monks. And so everybody is free to take advantage of that. And the more that we acquire that spirit of orthodoxy, the more people really around us will be healed. Yeah, this is problems for materialism and naturalism. You'll see that I made some of these critiques when I did my video on Quine. Can you have a naturalized epistemology? And that ends up being self-refuting as far as the ability to know anything whatsoever. Can you explain how God underlies coherentism? Well, in orthodoxy, we have something like coherentism, but that doesn't mean that because your epistemology subscribes to coherentism that it's correct. That in the end, that all of them end up being logically inconsistent or breaking down at some point. When we say that orthodoxy is coherent, like coherentism, where God offers that, again, we're not pitting against that it's not foundational, because God ends up being foundational. But not just God, it's the revelation of God to his saints carried out through the church and the fullness of that. So what we are rejecting is the Western model of what's called classical foundationalism. So natural theology uses the Western philosophic model, and this comes from Descartes, of classical foundationalism. So we're not against the idea of foundations, but the epistemological project founded out of modernity and adopted within the West, within natural theology, is fundamentally flawed, is classical foundationalism. Coherentism within epistemology began to replace classical foundationalism. This is a good book that talks about this. But it's not that the coherentists are free from problems either. However, when you start to study Orthodox theology, you realize that what we have is something that is not a classical foundationalist model. We do not use natural theology the way the West defines it and does it. And that we have something very much like a presuppositional starting point, which is God is the Lord and he has revealed himself to us. And that what he has revealed is the fullness of truth that is a coherent paradigm. So in that sense, we could say, yeah, it's like coherentism. Do you hear a hiss? Sounds like my computer. That's weird. I hear it too. It's my computer running overtime. Okay, well, with that, blessings, brothers and sisters. I hope you have a Merry Christmas for those of you on the new calendar on the 25th, and on the old calendar, the 7th. And happy holidays. And holidays, by the way, means holy days. So when people at the store think that they're trying to be nice and secular and say holidays, just repeat back to them. And yes, happy holy days to you as well. Christ is born. Let us glorify him. Christ is born. Let us glorify him. I wish all of you and your families the very best this nativity season, and looking forward to putting up some more streams very shortly. Merry Christmas. Blessings to you. To the prayers of our Holy Fathers, Lord Jesus Christ, our God, have mercy upon us and save us. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, now and ever, into ages of ages. Amen.